Food delivery jobs are supposed to be easy. You pick up the food, you drop it off, you get paid. It's mindless work. But there are some streets in this town where you should never, ever deliver, especially in the dead of night. I've been working for DoorDash for about a year to pay off my student loans. I usually prefer taking the late-night shifts. The roads are completely empty. There's no traffic to deal with, and the tips are usually better from people who are either too drunk or too tired to drive themselves. By November, the nights in my town get bitterly cold, and a thick, freezing fog usually rolls in around midnight. It was a Tuesday night. Business had been incredibly slow. I had been sitting in my car in a dark parking lot for almost 2 hours, just listening to the heater rattle and watching my breath fog up the windows. The dashboard clock read 2:45 a.m. I was just about to end my shift and go home when my phone suddenly buzzed with a loud notification. The screen lit up the dark cabin. It was a pickup order for a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The payout was unusually high, almost $30 for a single delivery. I couldn't pass it up. I drove over to the diner. The parking lot was completely empty. Inside, the place felt like a ghost town. The only person there was an older cook wiping down the counter. He looked exhausted. He didn't say a word to me. He just slid a brown paper bag across the counter. The receipt stapled to the outside simply read, 2 black coffees, 1 cherry pie. I grabbed the bag, but it felt strangely cold, almost like it had been sitting in a freezer rather than under a heat lamp. I didn't think much of it. I just wanted the money. I got back into my car and swiped the app to see the delivery address. It was for a place out on Elmwood Drive. I had lived in this town my whole life, but I rarely went out that way. Elmwood Drive was an old, winding road that bordered the dense pine woods outside the city limits. It was an area where the houses were miles apart, hidden behind thick trees. I pulled out onto the main road and started the drive. For the first 10 minutes, everything was normal. But as I turned onto Elmwood Drive, the atmosphere changed completely. The streetlights started getting further and further apart until they stopped altogether. The paved road turned into rough, cracked gravel. And then the fog rolled in. It wasn't just normal fog. It was thick, heavy, and unnatural. It hugged the ground and swallowed my headlights, reducing my visibility to less than 10 feet. The silence out here was suffocating. The only sound was the crunching of my tires on the gravel. I glanced at the GPS on my phone. The little blue arrow was crawling slowly along a black map. The estimated time of arrival kept jumping around. 3 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. It was like the app didn't know exactly where the house was. Finally, the GPS voice chimed in. You have arrived at your destination. I hit the brakes and put the car in park. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was exactly 3:13 a.m. I grabbed the cold paper bag and stepped out of the car. The freezing air hit me like a wall. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight and shined it toward where the house should be. But there was no house. My flashlight beam cut through the thick fog and illuminated a massive, blackened foundation. The place had burned to the ground. It didn't look recent, either. The wooden beams were completely charred into black ash, and nature had already started reclaiming the ruins with tall, dead weeds. The strange thing was, the smell of burnt wood and old ash was still incredibly strong, hanging heavily in the cold air. I stood there, confused. I thought the GPS must have messed up. I pulled out my phone to call the customer. I stared at the screen. I had 0 bars of service. The SOS only icon blinked at the top right corner. But that wasn't the weirdest part. My battery, which had been at 80% when I left the diner, was dropping right in front of my eyes. 15%, 10%, 5%. Suddenly, a notification popped up on the screen, bypassing the lack of service. It was a message from the customer in the DoorDash app. It just said, "Are you here?" My thumb hovered over the screen. I typed back, "I think the GPS is wrong. There is no house here. It's just burnt ruins." 3 seconds later, the reply came. "I know. Leave the food on the porch." My blood ran cold. There was no porch. There was nothing. Before I could type another word, a second message appeared on the screen. "I can see you." The moment I read those words, my phone screen glitched, turned black, and completely died. I was left in total darkness, with only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog. I was standing completely alone in the middle of nowhere, holding a bag of cold coffee and pie. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to run back to the car. And then, I heard it. Crack! A loud, distinct sound of a heavy branch snapping came from the center of the burnt ruins. I froze. I slowly pointed my flashlight toward the dark ashes. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps dragging across the charred wood. Scrape, thump, scrape, thump. A figure began to emerge from behind a blackened, standing chimney. It was a man. At least, it used to be a man. He was impossibly tall, standing well over 6.5 feet. But his clothes were completely melted into his skin. His entire body was blackened, resembling a walking piece of charcoal. The skin on his face was tight, drawn back, and heavily scarred from severe burns. Where his eyes should have been, there were only deep, dark, empty sockets. The smell of sulfur and rotting meat suddenly overpowered the smell of the ash. He didn't walk normally. His joints seemed stiff, locking into place with every dragging step. He slowly raised one long, charred, shaking arm and pointed a blackened finger directly at the food bag in my hand. Panic took over. I didn't think. I just reacted. I threw the paper bag onto the ash-covered ground and turned around, sprinting toward my car. My boots slipped on the wet grass, but I didn't stop. I reached the driver's side door and frantically yanked the handle. It was locked. I fumbled in my pockets with violently shaking hands. I pulled out my keys, but my fingers were trembling so badly that I dropped them onto the gravel. I looked back. The burnt figure was no longer by the chimney. He was moving toward me, gliding through the fog at an unnatural, terrifying speed, without making a single sound. I dropped to my knees, grabbed the keys from the dirt, jammed the fob, and ripped the car door open. I threw myself inside and slammed the heavy door locked just as the figure reached the edge of the road. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. Chug, 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 click. The engine wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead. I tried again. Click, click, click. Nothing. I looked at my driver's side window. The burnt man was standing right there. His terrifying, eyeless face was inches from the glass. He slowly raised his charred hand and pressed it flat against my window. I could hear his skin sizzling against the cold glass. He opened his ruined, melted mouth and let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a low, distorted, vibrating hum that made my own chest rattle. I screamed, closed my eyes, and turned the key one last time. The engine roared to life. The headlights snapped on, blasting the figure with light. I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas pedal as hard as I could. The tires spun in the gravel before catching grip, and I peeled away, leaving the burnt ruins behind in the fog. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the brightly lit center of town. I pulled into a gas station, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I got out of the car and looked at my driver's side window. Right there, perfectly preserved on the glass, was a greasy, black handprint made of ash and melted skin. The next day, I went to the local library and looked up the history of Elmwood Drive. It didn't take long to find. In 2019, a massive fire had completely destroyed a house at the end of the road. A father and his 2 kids were trapped inside and didn't make it out. The police report stated that the fire had started mysteriously in the middle of the night. The exact time the fire department received the call, 3:13 a.m. I deleted the DoorDash app that same morning. I will never do a delivery job again. And if you ever find yourself working a late-night shift and you get an order for Elmwood Drive, no matter how much it pays, just decline it.